The morning started the way most mornings do on our street. Quietly, unremarkably, with the kind of stillness that makes you believe the world is still in order. Birds were doing their thing in the oak trees. A sprinkler ticked lazily across someone's lawn. I had coffee in my hand and absolutely no intention of leaving my house before noon. But stillness on this street has a way of lying to you. It lures you into comfort, and then it cracks open without warning. The scream that split the air that morning was not the kind you brush off. It was raw, desperate, the kind that bypasses your brain entirely and goes straight to your gut. I put the coffee down before I even realized I was moving. When I reached the window and pulled back the curtain, what I saw on that sun-soaked street stopped my breath completely. An elderly woman was on the ground, and standing over her, gripping her wheelchair with both hands like it was a trophy she had just won, was Grace, our HOA president. Grace had been running this neighborhood like a small kingdom for the better part of 4 years. If you lived here, you knew her car before you knew her face. A polished black SUV that seemed to appear wherever rules were being broken or wherever she imagined they were. She had a posture that said she had never once doubted herself, a voice that carried 3 houses down without effort, and an expression permanently set somewhere between disappointment and disgust. She had sent notices about lawn heights measured to the inch. She had fined a family for a welcome mat she deemed aesthetically inconsistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. She had once called a resident's wind chimes a noise ordinance violation. We had all learned to either comply or ignore her, and most of us had quietly chosen the latter. But 3 weeks before that morning, something shifted. A new notice appeared in every mailbox on the street, printed on HOA letterhead in bold font. Effective immediately, no wheels of any kind were permitted within the community. No bicycles, no scooters, no skateboards, no exceptions. I remembered reading it at my kitchen table and setting it down with a slow exhale. Ridiculous, I thought, but not my problem. I had no bike. I had no scooter. What I failed to consider, what none of us considered, was that Grace's definition of wheels had no boundaries at all. By the time I reached the street, a small cluster of neighbors had already gathered on the edges of their lawns, frozen in that particular way people freeze when they witness something so wrong they cannot immediately process it. Mrs. Jenkins, 73 years old, a retired school teacher who had lived on this street longer than most of us had been alive, was sitting on the hot asphalt, her palms flat against the ground, trying to push herself upright. Her blouse was dusty, her elbow was bleeding, and Grace was standing 2 feet away, holding the wheelchair with both hands, delivering a lecture about community standards as though a woman was not struggling to stand upright in front of her. I heard the words before I fully arrived. "Rules exist for a reason," Grace was saying, her chin lifted, her tone measured with that infuriating calm she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while doing something monstrous. "I don't make the rules for myself. I make them for everyone." Mrs. Jenkins said something about her condition, about her doctor, about the fact that she could not walk without that chair, and Grace waved it away like an irrelevant detail, like a footnote in a document she had already decided to ignore. Something in me went very still, the kind of still that comes just before a decision gets made. I did not plan what happened next. There was no strategy, no carefully measured response. I crossed the remaining distance between us, and I reached for the wheelchair. Grace's reaction was immediate and vicious. She yanked it back so hard the rubber tires screamed against the pavement, her knuckles whitening around the frame, her eyes locking onto mine with something between fury and disbelief. Nobody defied Grace on this street. That was simply how things had always worked. But I kept my hand on the armrest, and I looked at her without flinching. And I pulled. For a moment, we were both holding it, both pulling in opposite directions, and the absurdity of the scene was not lost on me, even in the middle of it. 2 adults in a suburban street fighting over an elderly woman's wheelchair while neighbors filmed from their driveways. Grace's nails scraped across the metal frame as I finally pulled it free. She stumbled slightly, her composure cracking for the first time. I turned my back on her, wheeled the chair to Mrs. Jenkins, crouched down beside her, and helped her back into the seat as carefully as I could manage. She gripped my forearm with both hands and did not say a word. She did not need to. Grace was still talking behind me. She was talking about rules, about respect, about what this neighborhood stood for, her voice climbing higher with every step I took away from her. Someone in the crowd said something sharp. Someone else laughed, not warmly, but the kind of laugh that signals a tide has turned. I heard the phrase going viral before I even reached Mrs. Jenkins's front path, and I understood in that moment that what had just happened was not going to stay on this street. The phones had been out since the moment I arrived. The angles were good. The story told itself. I got Mrs. Jenkins inside and made sure she had water and that her elbow was cleaned and bandaged before I let myself think about anything else. When I stepped back outside 20 minutes later, Grace's driveway was already empty. The internet did not wait for morning. By that evening, the clips were moving fast, first through neighborhood group chats, then onto local Facebook pages, then outward in that exponential way that happens when footage is undeniable and the story requires no explanation. The comments were not kind. They were not meant to be. Her name appeared under words like cruel, disgraceful, and unfit in the same sentence over and over, in threads that grew longer by the hour. Local news stations had the footage by midnight. By the time the sun came up, Grace Johnson was a headline, not a neighborhood figure, not an HOA president. A headline. Her employer released a statement before 9 in the morning. It was one sentence, and it was final. Neighbors reported seeing her loading boxes from her office under security escort before lunch. Someone filmed that too and posted it with very little commentary because very little commentary was needed. The legal consequences arrived steadily and without mercy. Police reviewed the footage and opened an investigation within 48 hours. The charges that followed were not minor: assault, harassment, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Grace hired a lawyer and attempted to reframe the incident as a misunderstanding, as overzealous but well-intentioned rule enforcement, as something other than what every camera on that street had captured in full daylight. The judge was not persuaded. She was ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution to Mrs. Jenkins and sentenced to 4 months of community service. The location assigned for that service was a residential rehabilitation center for disabled adults. The HOA held an emergency meeting and removed her from the presidency by unanimous vote. Her mortgage lender, citing financial instability, began a reassessment of her loan terms. The for sale sign appeared in her yard 8 days later, slightly crooked, as though even it had given up trying to maintain appearances. The moving truck came on a Tuesday. A small group of neighbors gathered at the end of the block, not to help, not to say goodbye, but simply to watch. Mrs. Jenkins sat on her front porch in her wheelchair with a glass of iced tea and the particular stillness of someone who has already made peace with how things ended. Grace climbed into the passenger seat of the truck without looking at anyone. The engine started, and then she was gone. What she left behind was quieter than before, and lighter in a way that is difficult to describe to someone who has not lived under that kind of weight. The street felt like it could breathe again. Mrs. Jenkins planted new flowers along her front path the following weekend. Someone organized a block gathering. Nothing formal. Just people outside together without the low-grade tension that had quietly defined so many years of life here. It is easy, in retrospect, to wonder how things got so far. How one person's need for control was allowed to grow large enough to put a 73-year-old woman on the ground in front of her own neighbors. The answer is probably the same answer it always is. People stayed quiet because it was easier, because confrontation has a cost, because most of us believed it was not quite bad enough yet to act. Until one morning it was. And then it was. If you have watched this far, you already know what you think about what happened here. You do not need me to tell you whether justice was served. What I will say is this: Mrs. Jenkins deserved better from every single person on this street, including me, long before that morning. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to walk back inside. Like this video if this story moved you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories where the truth eventually finds its way to the surface. And tell me in the comments, have you ever lived next to someone like Grace? Because something tells me this street is not the only one.